My name is Eija Ranta. I am a Global Development Studies Scholar from the University of Helsinki. I will be presenting now my chapter, Development, a Multidimensional Concept. Development is an intrinsically complex term with multiple meanings. In the post-World War II era, this multidimensional concept provided an overarching framework for imagining and organizing relationships between South and North. Development as industrialization, technical advancement, and the exercise of individual liberties was intimately tied to the notion of Western democracy, thus establishing the development democracy nexus, which my chapter critically unravels. Western economic and political conditions were portrayed as the norm, thus legitimizing Western interventions. However, I will argue in my chapter that despite official discourses to the contrary, development's intimate relationship with growth agendas and Western economic and political interests throughout the decades has tended to bypass concerns for democracy. During the Cold War, Western development donors did not hesitate to support authoritarian regimes and coups if their economic interests were at stake. While democracy and human rights became conditionalities for foreign aid in the 1990s, their intimate tie-up with structural adjustment programs and mass-scale privatizations seriously eroded the meaning of democracy by creating an unpleasant association between liberal democracy and economic austerity measures. In my chapter, I suggest that it is not possible to understand this discrepancy without dismantling the anatomy of the concept of development itself. Consequently, my chapter demonstrates that development is not solely commensurate with the post-World War II international apparatus of development interventions, but rather has longer historical continuities with the developmental character of global capitalism, its colonial expansions and violence, and thus its multidimensionality. As we enter the 2020s, the intimate relationship between development and Western economic interests, corporate powers, industries, and technologies has generated ever more acute implications for democracy. There is an increasing awareness that in times of climate emergency, development deeply rooted in unsustainable Western production and consumption patterns of global capitalism is rather the problem and not the solution. My chapter introduces the critique of development through a scrutiny of post-development and post-colonial scholarship in search of more democratic alternatives to conventional growth-centered development thinking and practice. To illustrate the case for alternatives, my chapter focuses empirically on the emergence and implementation of the notion of buen vivir, living well, as an ecological and sociocultural alternative originating from Latin America. However, I also discuss the problems and shortcomings of development alternatives, especially in terms of consequences for democratic elements when progressive governments ostensibly adopt alternative development concepts. Meanwhile, at grassroots levels, the search for alternatives continues, deepening economic and social inequalities, the concentration of wealth, a lack of poor quality of services, which has become very visible during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the inability to participate in political decision-making are still part of everyday life for many in the global South. Development as the advancement of global industrial capitalism and its production and consumption patterns has proved socially and environmentally unsustainable. Development agencies may compensate for the worst effects, but they lack both the will and the means to effect structural transformations that target the very core of global capitalist processes. As we enter the 2020s, the emphasis on systemic alternatives is ever more crucial.